All right, let's dive right into this explainer and trace what is arguably one of the most sprawling, foundational narratives in human history. Today, we're tracking the epic timeline of the Judeo-Christian tradition. We'll follow it from the very dawn of creation, through ancient covenants and kings, all the way to its ultimate culmination in the New Testament texts. It's a massive, sweeping story of promises made, broken, and ultimately fulfilled. We've got a lot of ground to cover today, compressing thousands of years of textual history into a single thread. We're going to start at the dawn of creation in the fall, move through the covenants of the patriarchs, highlight some truly extraordinary women of faith, witness the arrival of the promised Messiah, and finally wrap up with his miracles, death, and resurrection. So, starting with the dawn of creation and the fall, we're beginning at the very origin of everything in the text, setting the stage for a world that is described as both deeply beautiful and profoundly broken. Think about that famous line from Genesis, "Let there be light," and there was light. It perfectly captures the sheer power of the spoken word here. Out of total, empty darkness, the cosmos is essentially ordered into existence simply by a command. Before anything else even exists, a light is raised. The text lays out this highly organized, almost poetic progression. You've got 6 days of creation culminating in a 7th day of rest. Day by day, it's like a giant puzzle coming together. God separates the sky from the waters, brings forth dry land, and populates the earth with plants, animals, and finally, humanity. And humanity is given this unique role to rule over the earth, made in the divine image. And at the end of it all, the whole shebang is declared very good. But as you probably know, that perfection doesn't last. The narrative immediately introduces this stark contrast between paradise and human rebellion. In Eden, humanity is in perfect harmony, completely unashamed. But then comes the serpent's temptation. They choose to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and boom, that innocence just shatters. Adam and Eve hide, and they're ultimately expelled into a cursed world of painful labor. But, and this is absolutely crucial, tucked right inside that judgment is the initial seed of redemption, a promise that an offspring will one day crush the serpent. Moving into our next section, the covenants of the patriarchs. As humanity leaves Eden and multiplies, the narrative shifts to focus on these foundational agreements established with key historical figures. You really have to wonder, how on earth did humanity bridge the gap from a devastating flood to the calling of a man named Abraham? Well, the text outlines this tragic cycle of human corruption. It gets so bad it leads to a great flood, where only Noah's family is spared. And even after that, you have the scattering of humanity at Babel, when their languages are suddenly confused. To bring order to this chaos, God establishes covenants. Think of these as ancient, binding legal and spiritual contracts meant to sustain the faith of generations. For Noah, after the floodwaters finally recede, a rainbow appears, a literal sign in the sky guaranteeing the earth will never be entirely destroyed by water again. Later on, God calls Abraham out of Haran and sets up a deeply personal covenant. This one is marked by circumcision and comes with a mind-blowing promise, descendants as numerous as the stars. That specific promise to Abraham, it's the absolute anchor of the entire biblical epic. The text says, "All peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So it's not just about one family getting a piece of land in Canaan. It's a structural guarantee built into the narrative that a global blessing is going to emerge through his lineage. It's the continuous thread of hope that sets up literally everything that follows. Which brings us to the extraordinary women of faith. Because look, this epic isn't just a story about patriarchs and kings. It is deeply, fundamentally shaped by the profound courage of women. Across the Old Testament, ordinary women are turning the tides of history. You have Miriam leading a massive, triumphant worship song after the Israelites escape Egypt. There's Rahab, an outcast living in Jericho, whose bold decision to hide Israelite spies cements her place in this Graham lineage. Then you've got the Queen of Sheba traveling immense distances to seek truth from Solomon, and Huldah, a bold prophetess whose authority directly sparked a massive national revival. Their stories aren't just side notes. They are critical pillars holding up the entire narrative architecture. Now we jump across the centuries to our next section. The promised Messiah arrives. This is where ancient anticipation finally collides with New Testament reality. And talk about a massive subversion of expectations. For generations, humanity, specifically the people of Israel, had been waiting for a mighty, earthly conqueror to smash their oppressors. But how does the fulfillment actually arrive? In quiet, profound humility. The accounts in Luke and Matthew tell us Jesus wasn't born in a royal palace. He was born to a young virgin named Mary and a blue-collar carpenter named Joseph, and his very first bed was a feeding trough, a manger, because the local inn was completely full. The whole shift gets kicked off by the angel Gabriel's announcement to Mary. That poetic declaration, "Do not be afraid, Mary," injects this huge divine energy right into the story, shifting the fate of mankind. And Mary's humble acceptance of this totally wild, seemingly impossible calling, it perfectly sets the stage for the New Testament's central figure. And he is given the ancient prophetic title Emmanuel. Literally translated, it means God with us. So the crucial point here is that this baby, who was recognized by those starry-eyed wise men from the east and by devout prophets like Simeon and Anna in the temple, was viewed as the actual, literal embodiment of God coming to dwell with regular people. It completely bridges the gap between the untouchable, holy creator of Genesis and the dusty, ordinary streets of first-century Nazareth. That sets us up for our final section: miracles, death, and resurrection. After spending his hidden years privately learning the carpentry trade, Jesus bursts onto the public scene. And he brings the entire biblical arc to its dramatic climax. Take the Sermon on the Mount, for example. He's outlining a kingdom that is built on a love that almost defies human reason, rather than on earthly power. I mean, he's teaching things that completely flip the social order upside down. He blesses the poor and the meek. He commands his followers to literally love their enemies and turn the other cheek. He warns against just going through the religious motions to get public attention, basically reframing the ancient laws of Moses to focus heavily on the inner condition of the human heart. But, it wasn't just words, it was intense action. The text is absolutely packed with step-by-step accounts of Jesus restoring sight to the blind, calming literal storms, and feeding thousands of people with just a couple of loaves of bread. But here's the catch. Every single miracle, every teaching drew massive crowds, sure, but it also planted the seeds of some very fierce religious opposition. By choosing to heal on the Sabbath and grabbing dinner with societal outcasts, he was directly challenging the strict traditions of the religious elite. And that suspicion quickly escalated into deadly hostility. Which brings us to the most pivotal days of the narrative, unfolding at breakneck speed. It goes from this celebrated triumphant entry into Jerusalem straight into a dark, devastating betrayal by one of his own disciples. That leads to his arrest and ultimately a brutal execution on a Roman cross. It was a death explicitly designed to silence him forever. But the text doesn't end in a tomb. According to the accounts, on the third day, the stone blocking his grave was just gone. He appears to his followers over the next 40 days before ascending, turning what looked like total, crushing defeat into this unshakable, world-changing triumph. As the quote captures it perfectly, the grave could not hold him. Death had no claim. That empty tomb is the absolute climax of the texts. It's presented not just as a standalone miracle, but as the literal, final fulfillment of that very first promise, made all the way back in Eden. The serpent is crushed, and death itself is defeated. So, what does this all mean for us? How does this sweeping story of faith, promise, and destiny continue to shape the foundation of hope for billions of people alive today? As we wrap up this explainer, I really want you to chew on that. Think about how these ancient words are still echoing through modern history. From a single spoken word in the darkness of creation to an empty tomb in Jerusalem, this text remains one of the most profoundly influential epics ever recorded. I encourage you to look at the patterns we've discussed today and see how they form a singular, continuous narrative. Thanks so much for exploring this epic journey with me.